Hello, my name is Mike, and today we're building a Befaco HexMix. This video is not sponsored. I paid for the kit with my own money, and the background music to this video was made featuring the Befaco HexMix. This build took over 14 hours to complete. The kit comes with paper instructions. These are kind of going out of style. More and more we're finding the instructions online. It's always a good idea to go over the instructions before starting a build. This kit comes with a lot of components, and the difficulty comes from getting everything to fit together in very tight quarters. The kit comes with a power connector, as well as a connector for the HexMix VCA, a module which I already have. This socket is for connecting to the HexMix expander module, which I do not have. The kit includes 96 10K resistors, which I'm showing off right here. Now I begin the process of measuring each group of resistors with a multimeter and placing and soldering them to the PCB. I start with the lowest quantity of resistors first. Here you can see I'm doing bundles of 2, and then I will work my way up to the largest quantity of resistors of a given value. In this case, the 96 10K resistors will be the ones I place last. I'm finding that some of these resistors have through holes that are connected to the hole of another component. It is very difficult to solder a resistor into one hole without closing up the other hole connected to it. So I look up the value of the connected resistor and place it so I can solder them both at the same time. Here I'm pointing out those 2 resistors that connect. I'm having a hard time reading the screen print for resistor 297, so I refer to the diagram of the circuit board in the instructions. Here I'm showing another pair of connected through holes. This time, the 2 through holes that are touching are connecting a resistor with a capacitor. So I'm going to need to skip forward a bit and dig into my bag of capacitors if I want to take care of both of these at once. There's a second capacitor that's paired with a resistor, so I go ahead and do that one too. I've found that I've made a mistake. Up to this point, it seems like the resistor numbers have been screen printed above their through hole for the most part. But in this area, they are printed below the through hole. I'm lucky I've only soldered one in place, as I could have easily done an entire row like this. I happen to have a flux pen handy for some projects I'm going to do after this one. I use it and some copper braid to help desolder the errant resistor. Desoldering is never easy, and it always pays to be extra careful to avoid having to do it at all. Now, I need to solder in a resistor that already had its legs trimmed off. And finally, because of the circumstances, I want to test this resistor with a multimeter just to make sure everything is good. It appears that the operation was a success. Here I'm pointing out that there are more through holes that are touching each other where two resistors are connected. I want to solder both resistors at the same time, as that is easier than trying to do them separately without accidentally closing the hole. Now we're just down to the 10K resistors. Have more through holes that are connected, but this time they're oriented diagonally instead of side by side. Finished with the resistors, and we can move on to the diodes. Now each diode has a stripe. That stripe has to match the stripe that's printed on the PCB. It does matter which way these are oriented. of the diode symbols printed on the PCB is covered somewhat by the metal from a through hole, so I'm consulting with the diagram included in the instructions to make sure I have my diode pointed in the right direction. Soldering diodes, I like to do one leg for each diode, then go back and complete the second leg. Diodes can overheat, so I like to be extra cautious. Now we have these two larger gray diodes. Next are the ferrite beads. We thread a discarded resistor leg through the center of each ferrite bead so we can place them on the PCB and solder them. Now we move on to the IC sockets. The notch on the PCB must be on the same side as the notch on the IC socket. I like to solder one pin of each IC socket, then verify that the socket is flat against the PCB before soldering the rest of the pins. Next up are the capacitors. We are going to start with the non-polarized capacitors first and set the transistors and the polarized electrolytic capacitors aside. Now we're placing the pink WIMA capacitors. Per the instructions, 3 of these capacitors are in a tight space, and it says leave some slack for the jumper pins. So I'm setting those aside so I can place them after the jumper pins are in place. three-legged transistors are up next. The flat side of the transistor needs to line up with the flat side of the diagram printed on the PCB. Transistors are also heat sensitive, so I like to solder one leg on each transistor placed at a time before coming back for a second and third pass for the other two legs. Now we're moving on to the electrolytic capacitors. These are polarized, so orientation matters, and the longer leg must go into the hole on the PCB that is marked positive with a plus sign. Electrolytic capacitors are also heat sensitive, so I like to do these one leg per capacitor at a time. Next up are the Vactrols. I've worked with Vactrols before back when I built a mutes kit, but I forgot how the Vactrol markings looked on the PCB. This time I was confused at first, but after reviewing the diagram and instructions, I understand now how they're supposed to go in. The shortest leg goes into the hole marked negative, and the two longest legs go on the opposite side away from the positive and negative markings. I also forgot the last time. I learned the best way to place these Vactrols was to put the long legs through the holes first, then bend them over and put the short legs in. So I made a bit of a mess out of the first Vactrol. We now come to the socket connectors. I have the opportunity to add those last three WIMA capacitors so I can solder them at the same time as the socket connectors. But what I failed to take into account was the two sets of three holes right beneath those capacitors that are for a couple of the potentiometers. I should have placed the WIMA capacitors so they were slightly raised upwards to ensure I could fit a soldering iron past them to get to the through holes below. This causes a bit of a problem later. Next, we're doing the pin headers. I like to insert the pin headers into their sockets and then place the board on top of the pin headers to solder them. That way, I guarantee that the pins will line up with their sockets. Initially, I feel like the two boards are too close together, so I decide to add the spacer to get them the exact distance apart that they're supposed to be. Now we're adding the power connector. The power connector is sandwiched in between the two PCBs. Next, we are adding the communication ports. This first one goes to the HexMix VCA, which I own. This next one goes to the Stimix module, which I also have. And this large connector here is what allows the HexMix to connect to the Hexpander module. I currently do not have one of those. Finally, there's a little switch that allows you to set the output of the HexMix to either line level or modular level. Next, we're placing 21 ICs into their sockets. All of the ICs are TL072 amplifiers. This is an IC pin straightener. You can buy them online. This makes working with ICs so much easier and saves a bunch of time. It is important to make sure that the dot on the IC faces the same direction as the notch on the socket. If you place an IC backwards, and I've done this before, you might get a puff of smoke when you power the module on. Not only will the IC be destroyed if that happens, but other components might get irreparably damaged as well. Now we install the spacers again, this time for good. Next up, we add the front panel hardware, but we do not solder any of it yet. First, we start with the minijacks. Then, the potentiometers. Some stray solder got into the hole for the location lug for this potentiometer. I skip over it for a moment before coming back to it. I go straight for my copper braid, but a solder sucker probably would have been better. I try the braid multiple times before I finally add some flux. This does the trick. Flux is truly magical, but the fumes it gives off are terrible. Now we add the switches. First, we must remove all of the washers and nuts. I miss that there's a second nut on each switch underneath the washer. We do not use these and they can be thrown out. These switches have 3 positions. Off is in the middle, and then one side latches and stays on, and the other side is momentary, meaning it is only engaged while you're pressing it, and as soon as you let go, it will go back to the middle. We want the momentary side to be on the bottom. There is a slot in the neck of the momentary side of the switch. With the switches in place, now we add the 3-legged LEDs. The longest leg is in the middle. The second longest leg goes into the hole marked with an L, and the shortest leg goes into the hole marked with an S. After the last session, I set this down wrong, and the LEDs and a bunch of other components all popped out. So we're putting this back together so we can try placing the panel on it again. There are a lot of loose, unsoldered parts to fit the front panel over, and you want to do your best not to push any of them out of their through holes. Once we have the front panel on, we want to secure it by screwing in the nuts. I start with the 4 corners and then work my way around the outside, moving inward. As we tighten the nuts for the potentiometers, they raise up a bit. We want this to happen so the potentiometers are at the proper height when we solder them in. I'm noticing here that some of the legs push right against the plastic of the communication port. I can't imagine soldering these without melting at least some of the plastic. Now we begin soldering. My plan here is to solder in the LEDs first so I can trim their legs and get them out of the way. I accidentally touched a capacitor, melting the plastic casing. All I can do is hope that it's fine and the damage is just cosmetic. Next, I want to solder the mini jacks and switches in place, but my idea was to hold off on soldering in the potentiometers in case I needed to reflow any of the components underneath them. This didn't work, as I did not get any sound when I tested the module. Here I'm combining the PCBs so I can test the module. I got no sound because I did not solder in any of the potentiometers, but I got lights. Now I'm back after my failed test. I started soldering in the potentiometers before I was recording, so here we're picking up where I left off with the 6-pin master volume and EQ knobs along the side. There are potentiometer legs right underneath the WIMA capacitors here. I do my best to solder them without hitting the capacitors or anything else nearby. Here I'm thinking about switching out the tip of my soldering iron, but that doesn't seem like it will help. So I'm going to resort to taking the front panel off and soldering this potentiometer from the other side. Unscrewing all of the nuts takes forever. Now I combine the boards to test them again. The module is now working, but I still need to solder in the location lugs on the potentiometers. I am once again securing the front panel by screwing in all the nuts. I expected the module to be working this time, but now channel 1 has barely any sound. It definitely worked right before I soldered the location lugs, so I'm trying to use the multimeter to zero in on where the problem is. I don't find anything obvious, so I just start reflowing various locations up and down channel 1. I've tested the module again, and this time channel 1 has no sound at all. I try to find something conclusive with my multimeter, but nothing seems amiss compared to the other channels. I start reflowing solder yet again. When I test it again, it finally works. Now that I finally have a working module, I put all of the nuts and knobs on. At last, the build is a success. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, please consider liking and subscribing. Have a great day.